Hi, George.
Hey, Bob.
How are you?
Pretty well, thanks.
Good. I should tell people that I'm Robert Wright and you're George Perkovich at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I think you're director of what, the Nuclear
Policy Program, yeah.
Nuclear Policy Program. Then you're just the person I want to talk to. Because I want someone who can shake me from my belief that our approach to controlling the spread of nuclear weapons is totally screwed up. And when I say our, I mean both the international community's approach as embodied in the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and America's approach as embodied in the policy in recent years. So do you think you're up to that task?
I can't wait.
And you're reasonably upbeat about things. Is that overstating the case? You think we kind of got things under control, or what?
Well, in general, I'm pretty pessimistic about the way the world's going. But on the nuclear side, I certainly don't think, the sky's falling and this is the worst moment we've ever been in.
Okay.
Nor do I think the situation's hopeless, but it's not going great.
Yeah. Okay. That qualifies as upbeat in my universe.
Okay.
So maybe we could start off by talking about the most topical incarnation of this, which is Iran. But before we do that, maybe you could just introduce us to the context of this by just saying in a couple of sentences what the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty is.
Yeah. Well, basically, the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the Cold War realized that they shared one interest, which was keeping everybody else from not acquiring nuclear weapons. So they started a negotiation which culminated in 1968, laying out a framework that said, all right, look, the 5 countries that have nuclear weapons now in 1968 will promise to get rid of them eventually if everybody else will promise not to acquire them. Mm-hmm. That was the basic bargain of the treaty. There were some other things, too. We'll help you who do not acquire nuclear weapons. We'll help you get the peaceful benefits of atomic energy, the nuclear power plants and other things. So this bargain, which took some years to negotiate, was the basis of the Nonproliferation Treaty. Mm-hmm. And early on, not everyone signed up to it. So France didn't sign up until 1992, and it was allowed to have nuclear weapons under the treaty. Mm-hmm. But by 1995, almost every country in the world, with the exceptions of Israel, India, and Pakistan, had signed up to this basic bargain.
Mm-hmm. And and you just mentioned 3 of the countries that have nuclear weapons now, beyond the original 5 who had them at the time that the treaty was signed. And the 4th country that has nuclear weapons is North Korea. They developed them, I guess, covertly while a member of the treaty, but then got out of the treaty, which actually members are allowed to do. And so I guess technically are no longer in violation of the treaty.
And actually, North Korea is an example of how you could say and think that the system has worked, even though North Korea represents a failure. And it's because North Korea is the only country in the world, or around 200 countries in the world, it's the only one that has been a part of this treaty and then cheated and acquired nuclear weapons.
Okay.
That's it.
But there are some people who think that Iran is on the verge of that, so I guess that leads us naturally to a discussion of Iran. Now, first of all, let's get clear. Is Iran actually clearly in violation of the treaty right now? I mean, Iran is a member of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. It is enriching uranium, I guess, but that in itself is not a violation of the treaty, right?
That's right. And there's a bit of a debate about whether Iran is in violation of the Nonproliferation Treaty itself. We can talk about that. Or what is not debatable is that Iran is in violation of what are called its safeguard obligations with the International Atomic Energy Agency. What that means is once you join the Nonproliferation Treaty and promise that you won't acquire nuclear weapons, you then have to sign an agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is like the inspection agency. They're the ones that monitor and verify that you're living up to your commitments. And under the agreement that you have with the inspection agency, you are obligated, among other things, to declare certain kinds of nuclear work that you do. You're obligated to declare if you import things like uranium or slightly enriched uranium. And it was discovered in 2003, basically, that Iran had for years failed to fulfill its obligations to report things that it was doing in the nuclear domain. And so these were violations. It still has not been proved that Iran is actually seeking to build a nuclear weapon, which would be the fundamental violation of the Nonproliferation Treaty. And, and so that's where a lot of the argument is, including in the U.S. intelligence community. There's arguments about this.
Okay. Now, so Iran kind of, to me, illustrates some of the shortcomings of the treaty. I mean, for example, the fact that it turns out that they had this whole secret program going and we didn't know about it, in some ways, I guess, reflects the limits on the inspections that are part of the treaty, right? The original deal was that the international community gets to inspect your official declared sites where you might be, using nuclear energy or whatever. But the inspectors don't have the power to kind of go wherever they want and inspect anything suspicious. If they had that power, maybe Iran wouldn't have gotten as far as it's gotten. And I gather there is something called the Additional Protocol, which some countries have chosen to sign on to, which somewhat strengthens the safeguards, but still, by and large, a member of the treaty is far from having to expose itself to the kinds of inspections that could really assure the international community that there's nothing going on, right?
That's correct. I mean, and there are reasons for it which we can debate. For example, in other treaties, and if the U.S. were ever to disarm, the U.S. doesn't want to allow inspectors to come anytime, any place into the U.S.
Right.
In the negotiations, we have allies who didn't want to have those kinds of inspections. So that this is a real problem in the case of Iran is true, but the reasons behind it are some that require some introspection as well.
Is there any prospect of the treaty then, in light of these kinds of political considerations and the fact that the United States, often resists as much as any nation the kind of incremental surrender of sovereignty that is sometimes required by really effective international agreements? Is there any realistic prospect that the inspection regime of the treaty is going to get a lot stronger?
Well, great question. No, I would say not in the near term, because power shifting in the world. The power is growing in countries like Brazil, India, South Africa, Turkey, Indonesia, developing countries that feel like they've gotten screwed in a lot of the international regimes and the frameworks that were set up after the Second World War. And they want the terms to be very different. And you hit on it earlier. They're especially sensitive to protecting national sovereignty because for many of them, they just acquired it in the last decades, and they're reluctant to give it up. So to have the kind of inspections that we would agree would be much better to prevent nuclear proliferation, these countries would have to agree to be willing to allow that and surrender that kind of sovereignty. And for them to do that, they're going to want something in return. Now, the thing most likely they're going to want in return is a much clearer commitment that we and the other countries that have nuclear, that we're going to give them up. And not just mañana or someday, undefined. They're going to say, in return for those kinds of inspections, date certain, sign the contract when you're going to give these things up. The U.S. government isn't going to do that, and so we're back in this kind of messy process that we're experiencing with Iran.
And I gather that part of the idea of the global zero movement, which I think you're part of, which is, a kind of an expression of the aspiration to actually rid the world of nuclear weapons. I guess part of the idea is to help reassure these nations that the nuclear-armed nations really do have some kind of serious intention to give up weapons ultimately, or not?
Yeah, the basic idea, and there's an organization called Global Zero, and then there are people, myself included, but Henry Kissinger and George Shultz and so on, who are similarly saying that we'd be better off trying to really get rid of nuclear weapons. Those are two distinct entities or positions, but we all agree that one of the reasons for this is that the only stable situation is going to be one where there's equity. That you can't maintain a system where just a few countries say, look, nuclear weapons are absolutely fantastic. We love them. We're never going to get rid of them. Oh, and by the way, no one else can have them. That's a recipe for instability. And that the only way to get a real commitment for others not to acquire nuclear weapons, and then to allow the kinds of inspections that you would need to give you some confidence in that, the only way to do that is from a position of equity, where you say, look, we're not trying to privilege just ourselves. We're all going to be in the same position where no one has these weapons. And in order to make that possible, we have to have a lot more confidence in the inspection system and so forth. So I think that is the logic behind the advocacy of moving, not unilaterally, but collectively moving towards zero.
But that would, as you suggest, have to ultimately be accompanied by an inspection regime way more intrusive than what we have now. I mean,
I think inspections are important, but I think more important is enforcement, which may even be more difficult. In other words, you could have a really good inspection regime, and the inspectors could find somebody's cheating. That's actually what happened with Iran. And then the question is, the real hard part is, what do you do when somebody's cheating? The system as we have it actually has worked in Iran, remarkably enough. They got caught. They were detected. There have been inspections that have further uncovered, what they didn't report, outstanding questions that caused doubt. There have been 6 Security Council resolutions. That's the way the system's supposed to work. They're not supposed to be 6, but it's supposed to go to the Security Council to demand enforcement. Here is the problem. What muscles behind there? How do you actually do enforcement? That, much more than the inspection issue, it seems to me, is key. And we don't have a good answer to that question because the enforcers don't all agree amongst themselves. Russia and China and the United States don't look at the world the same way. A lot of the world looks at what we did in enforcing resolutions in Iraq, right, with the war in 2003, and they say, well, if that's enforcement, no thank you. We don't want that. And so that's the mess we're dealing with, which I think is much more an enforcement issue than an inspection issue.
Right. Well, in fact, I mean, in the case of Iraq, we actually were on the verge of demonstrating a very effective enforcement mechanism, which is that you demand that the guy open up his country to inspectors, and he actually said yes, but then we said, well, we're going to invade anyway.
We didn't believe the answer. Right.
Right. Well, we should have, because he did let the inspectors in, and he did let them look wherever they wanted. So, I mean, that is, when I said early on, I think the failure is both in terms of the international regime structure and American policy. To me, this is an example, we seem never mindful, and I mean the Obama administration as well as the Bush administration, we seem never mindful of the importance of building up these institutions, these international institutions, in a way that will lead them to someday be effective. And this, to my mind, was a good example.
Yep.
But I don't think Bush alone is guilty. I don't. Anyway, let me ask you a little more about Iran. Is there? Well, you were talking about policing enforcement mechanisms. I mean, am I right that they fall into two kinds of categories? You know, non-military, such as economic sanctions, and military, such as bombing or invasion. I mean, and we're trying with Iran right now. We're trying the non-military, right?
Yeah, and I in the non-military, you mentioned economic sanctions, but I think for a country like Iran, you know, political isolation has some value too. It's not decisive, but this is unlike North Korea. This is not a hermit kingdom. This is not a society that wishes to be isolated or has been isolated. It's a leading civilization. So I think the political isolation has also been part of the pressure. But fundamentally, you're alluding to the big problem that if you use non-physical means, whether it's economic or political isolation and pressure, if the government in question decides they can ride that out, that they can withstand that, then you get to this impasse or this crucial moment where the rest of the world has to say, okay, the next step becomes physical. We're going to try to force an outcome. And again, Iraq was a bitter lesson of what can happen when you try that. And many people have concluded that that solution is worse than the problem it's meant to address.
Yeah, although I think, again, at the risk of seeming obsessed with this one thing, I think we have to be clear, that was not a case where the military option was earnestly used in an attempt to enforce nonproliferation. He let the inspectors in, right? I mean,
no, I agree.
Totally gratuitous invasion.
Yeah,
I mean, it just
right. I agree, but the problem is that how the rest of the world, or much of the rest of the world, feels about it and perceives it is that this was the cops, busting down the door to enforce nonproliferation.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a valuable lesson that wars are very messy, and I suspect that some people. This is probably not, especially within the realm of expertise of either of us, what the consequences of a war with Iran are. There are some people who think this could be relatively clean because you could just bomb them or something. I'm not sure they've really thought that.
You're right. I'm a bit out of my depth, but I've looked at it somewhat, and I can tell you that the Pentagon, including in the Bush administration, looked at it very, very hard. And they came away with the conclusion that you can't do what you would want to or need to do in terms of destroying so much of Iran's capacity to make nuclear weapons, but also to retaliate to the strikes that you would inflict on them. Mm-hmm. You can't do that with the confidence that our political leaders and military leaders require in order to say this is a viable plan. And so the Pentagon, Cheney and Bush wanted to have an option like that, and the Pentagon came back 3 different times saying we can't do that. We can certainly destroy targets that we pick. There's no question about that. But can you identify all the targets you would need to identify and keep them destroyed for as long as you would need? The answer tends to be negative.
Right. And leaving aside the various retaliatory mechanisms at Iran's disposal in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and via Lebanon and so on. So I guess that leads to the question, have we really exhausted all options in Iran? I mean, remind me, I'm a little unclear, but is our position still that they should not be allowed to enrich uranium, or what? I mean, I know that a big point of national pride on their part is that they should at least have the right to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes.
Yeah, and that is not disputed. There's been bad messaging, as it were. No one disputes that Iran has the right to do enrichment of uranium, to have a nuclear fuel cell.
Okay, so we had a little technical glitch there, but you were saying what?
Yeah, I'm trying to recollect the
It was about the messaging problem there had been on the question of whether Iran is entitled to enrich uranium.
So basically, Iran does have a right to do enrichment, but it has to be for peaceful purposes, which Iran is committed to doing. So the issue is, since there are doubts based on evidence that the IAEA has discovered that Iran's project is entirely peaceful, the Security Council said you need to suspend enrichment to give everybody pause and time to go clarify your intentions, to resolve the issue with the IAEA, and then everyone says you could resume enrichment once you've demonstrated that it was entirely peaceful, or if it wasn't peaceful, you've come clean, and now we've agreed on steps you're going to take to reassure the world that when you enrich going forward, it will not be for military purposes. So that's the position now of the U.S. and others, that what they're asking of Iran is to suspend, but with the understanding that Iran would resume enrichment for the reasons that you mentioned, even if they don't have an economic need for it, for national pride, they've decided that's what they want to do.
But I gather part of the problem is that in terms of domestic politics, for their leadership to comply with this demand would sort of seem like surrender?
Well, yes and no. I mean, first of all, I think Iranian leaders have a hard time understanding Iranian public opinion, and I know certainly we do. Iranian politics are very, very difficult. And there's public opinion polling, but you have to look carefully at how the questions are asked. So people in Iran insist that it must be allowed to have a nuclear program. But the phrase nuclear program can mean many things. Does it mean nuclear enrichment program? Or does it mean a program to produce electricity with nuclear weapons?
Right.
Does it mean a nuclear weapon program? And so the Iranian government itself has never said it wants a nuclear weapon program. I think the majority of Iranian people, if you asked, would say that's not what we mean by nuclear program. And so I think there's room, and this is fortunate, there's room in what all of the statements that Iranian leaders have made over the years, there's room for them to say, look, we won. We insisted we had the right to a nuclear program. That's now been accepted and guaranteed. And we're going to continue going with that program. But we always insisted we never wanted a nuclear weapon. And these arrogant, whatever words you want to use to call the U.S., they never believed us. They were the liars. They were the ones that abused the system. But we finally persuaded them that, in fact, we don't want nuclear weapons. We only want a peaceful program. And so we've agreed on the following, 9 things to do that. So that framework is available for them. What's made it more difficult now is that the internal competition in Iran is so intense, that the members of the Iranian elite hate each other so much that any time one of them looks like it's interested in perhaps making a deal, the other one's sabotage. So Ahmadinejad wanted to make a deal, and he got hammered at home for giving away the store.
Right, it was the Greens, it was the reformers, who we think are the good guys, who actually opposed his accepting that deal, as I understand it, in an attempt to kind of outflank him politically, right?
Right. And Larijani, who is the Speaker of the Parliament, who had tried to deal earlier, and Ahmadinejad, basically knifed him in the back for dealing. And so when Ahmadinejad tried it, Larijani said, "This is going to be sweet. You're getting it." And that's the way the politics work there. Part of the problem is Iran is one of the few countries in the world where the United States is popular. And for many years, Iranians have known that the leadership that makes a breakthrough with the United States is going to get a lot of public support. And so there's been a competition. I was in Iran years ago when somebody said, "George, you don't understand. We, the conservatives, will always block anybody else who tries to make a deal with the U.S. because we know it's a winning proposition. So the only way to get it is to come through us, the conservatives. because we're the only ones that can make it happen. Now what we found is even Ahmadinejad, who's a true blue conservative, he can't make a deal because other conservatives and the more liberal ones try to sabotage him because they don't want him to get the kudos for making a deal.
Okay. Now, to what extent is this complicated by America's approach to other countries that are outside the NPT, the Nonproliferation Treaty, and yet have nuclear weapons? I mean, from an Iranian point of view, the most prominent of those would be Israel. But there's also India and Pakistan. And in all three of those cases, America has basically said, look, although, you know, you are not one of the original 5 nuclear powers that the NPT was supposed to confine the possession of nuclear weapons to, we're actually fine with you guys having nuclear weapons because you're our friends, right? Israel, Pakistan, India are all our allies. In Pakistan's case, maybe in an increasingly technical sense, but still they're our allies. And we say, and we don't complain about them having nuclear weapons. And so, you know, I would think that people in Iran say, wait a second, why can't we have them? Now, of course, one answer is you are members of the Nonproliferation Treaty. But, of course, the fact is that the treaty allows you to exit it. So if they did say tomorrow we're getting out of the treaty and then a year from now had nuclear weapons, they would have the same status in international law, I believe, as Israel, Pakistan, and India. But I doubt that America would then have a sudden change of heart and say, well, then it's okay for you to have nuclear weapons, right? So I've got to think that this must seem like a double standard to Iran.
Yes. Well, absolutely. I mean, you were right to cite the legal basis. They're in the NPT, and actually, you can't violate a treaty and then withdraw from it to then seek to escape the penalties.
Although all of that's legal. They could withdraw before they technically violate.
Well, but the point is they could do that, and there'd be lots of people arguing it legally. But in what really matters is public opinion and politics, and there the double standard is more important. Yeah. You're right, and in fact, we have a way of dealing with each of those 3 countries, Israel, India, and Pakistan, that angers and frustrates Iranians in different ways. So, you know, Israel, you know, it's the view of U.S. policy regarding the Palestinians, the occupation, everything, and then on top of that, the nuclear weapon issue, and we say nothing about it and so on. With India, we now irritate the Iranians because we changed all the rules to allow nuclear cooperation with India, which used to be forbidden by policies that the U.S. helped to create, right. and the Bush administration changed our mind and said, well, no, actually, India is our friend now.
Right, and if we could just crystallize the irony here, the idea of the NPT was basically, if you want us to help you with your nuclear energy program, sign on to the NPT, don't develop nuclear weapons. India said, we're not signing on, we are developing nuclear weapons, and then the Bush administration said, well, then we will help you with your peaceful energy program, right? So it's kind of exactly right. the message we said we weren't going to send.
Exactly, because you're a friend now and we're concerned about China, right. And so, you know, you can help it. So that one frustrates the Iranians for good reason. And then Pakistan for a different reason, which is, as you mentioned, we tried to stop Pakistan half-heartedly, and now they have it, and we still send a lot of money there and aid and everything else. And the Iranians say, wait, Pakistan's not a civilization. It's barely a country. These people created the Taliban. They created all the terrorists that you guys are fighting. None of those terrorists have ever come from Iran. So these guys have no culture, no civilization. They created all of your enemies. And then you say, yeah, it's fine they have nuclear weapons. But we, Iran, who are Persia, and have this great civilization, and don't do suicide bombings, and have opposed the Taliban, you're saying we can't even have centrifuges.
Of course, one reply to that would be you do give assistance to groups that do those things, like Hezbollah and Hamas. But right. Anyway, far be it from me to give that sermon to the Iranians.
Right, I know, and they're well. I mean, you know, they welcome that conversation. They say, right, there's an occupation, there's an unjust occupation. Et cetera,
right.
et cetera.
Okay. So they okay.
Right.
So go ahead. Sorry.
Well, no. So I mean, I'm just saying you're right in ways that actually go very deep and are specific in the sense that the Iranians, have a political upset over the different treatment we give, Israel, India, and Pakistan, from which we want to give Iran. And by the way, I mean, they're right in a way, but it goes back to a point that you made earlier. I mean, it is true if Japan, who is like Iran, part of the Nonproliferation Treaty, they have the same legal obligations as Iran does. If Japanese leaders wake up, tomorrow and say, you know what, we need nuclear weapons. China's getting big and strong, et cetera, et cetera. The U.S. is going to react differently to that than we do to the prospect of Iran getting nuclear weapons. That's a reality, but we have to do, as you said, do more to not make that reality so painfully apparent that it actually motivates people to do things that that aren't helpful.
Well, some might even just get radical and argue that not only should we try to make it not apparent, we should maybe try to make it not a reality. I mean, our policy is our friends get nuclear weapons, you guys don't. And that just seems to me an increasingly untenable, and not just in the sense that our friends were the original five, but our friends can sign on later, can acquire nuclear weapons now, and it's okay.
Right.
And that just seems to me an increasingly untenable position to take.
Right, and I think the only tenable position, actually, at least as a framework, is we all have to go to zero. Because any other position that you take gets you into one or more of these double standards, which becomes very, very hard to sustain.
Okay. Now, what about, although you concede that is you kind of convey that almost as an aspiration more than anything is going to be a reality anytime soon, and you do concrete incremental things.
Right, and I mean, I think the president was right, and other people who've criticized him are wrong when he said, we really mean this and want this to be a goal, because I think you go out and say, look, we really want to get to zero. We've identified and are willing to work with you to identify all the things that will have to happen, and they're really, really hard things, but they're in everybody's interest if we try to take on those things, like, resolving the Iranian issue, reconciling the Indians and the Pakistanis. That's all really tough stuff, but I wouldn't shy away from saying we're prepared to work for that, and we're looking for other people to join us on it.
Now, in terms of Iran's neighborhood, there is talk of what would be, I guess, a regional zero rather than a global zero, a nuclear-free Middle East zone or something, right?
Yeah, WMD free zone in the Middle East.
Right. Now, which basically means Israel would have to get rid of its nuclear weapons, right?
Well, among other things, yeah.
You mean it would have to get rid of other things? You mean there would be a whole structure put in place? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And other states would have to get rid of their chemical weapons and biological weapons and so on. Yeah.
Okay. I know. Are there states that are known to have biological weapons?
There are suspected programs. I don't, I don't follow them, but certainly on chemical weapons, there are, strong beliefs that Egypt and Syria. I'm trying to think of some of the other states that have those in the region.
Of course. There's some question as to whether chemical weapons really deserve to be classified as weapons of mass destruction.
And I don't think they do personally, but a lot of people.
Right. I mean, biological weapons can be contagious and can in that manner kill millions in principle. Chemical weapons can't. They're heavy, they're hard to deliver, and so on. But but anyway, I assume that if you really got serious about a nuclear-free Middle East zone, that would really get Iran's attention. And in fact, that would be a way for their government to declare victory in the eyes of their people, right? But
well, it would. But the question is then how do you define it? Because if such a zone, Israel and several other states, including all of the ones that worry about Iran, are not going to say that it's okay to do enrichment of uranium, even for peaceful purposes, in a zone free of nuclear weapons. They're just not going to accept the definition, which is the one the Iranians would want to say is right. No one should have nuclear weapons, which we, Iran, don't have. Everybody should get rid of nuclear weapons, which means Israel. But we'll keep doing enrichment because that's peaceful.
Yeah, but it's not like we've tried that option on them, right? I mean, it's not like we've said with a straight face, hey, we can get Israel to disarm. Would you guys quit processing? I mean, nobody's put that on the table, right?
That's true, and for a variety of reasons, it's true. I mean, and among the reasons is that no one believes that Iran is doing this because of Israel, which
no,
but it's an excuse, and so you could.
But there's another side to the calculation, which is that it would be considered such a huge political triumph domestically for an Iranian leader. If an Iranian leader said, "I'm the guy who got Israel to admit it has nuclear weapons and then got rid of them," I think that would be a very popular Iranian for a long time to come.
It could be, but then the reason they started this program was Iraq. And so somebody there will say, yeah, you fool, but it was never the Israelis that were the problem. It's the Arabs who are the problem. And, you know, we don't know what the rest of the Arabs are going to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right, but there would have
so
to
they
be
can choose which way to
presumably an intrusive inspection regime would be part of any nuclear, any nuclear-free Middle East deal, right?
Right. What happened?
Yeah. So anyway, I mean, you don't see. I mean, I don't think you don't see that happening. But the other question is, do you see any use of the concept of a nuclear-free Middle East in a rhetorical way that could be effective?
I do, and by the way, it's kind of obligatory now in the sense that last year in the meeting to review the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, it was agreed that there needs to be convened a conference of states to explore the creation of a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. So this is now kind of in play, and my sense of it is there's a potential opportunity there in the following way. Israel, there's no way any state, including Israel, would negotiate to get rid of its ultimate deterrent if it has neighbors who don't even accept its existence. So part of the requirement to actually take this seriously would be for all of the states in the region to recognize and accept Israel's existence. Right. Now, one way to do that, or to begin symbolizing it, would be for Israel to say, yeah, we'll show up at this conference that's being called, but we'll only show up if all of the other states in the region show up too. Well, that creates an interesting dilemma for states that don't recognize Israel's existence. Do you come sit at the table with them? You know, for the Syrians, for the Iranians, for the Saudis, for the Lebanese. It's an interesting dilemma. So if they do show up, then you can start having a conversation about, you can start having a conversation that's more frank about recognizing Israel's existence, addressing fundamental security issues. And if they don't show up, Israel and others can say, look, they're prepared to do. These guys were never serious, actually. They've been exploiting this issue, and the minute anybody calls their bluffs, they don't show up.
Now, after at the last NPT review conference, after there was some affirmation that you alluded to of the need for some such conference or something, didn't the United States then, having signed on to it at the review treaty, turn around and diss the idea or something? Or am I imagining?
Well, this was very painful. Several things happened. One is that in order to get the outcome from this conference that the U.S. and the rest of the world wanted, the U.S. agreed to support the idea of this conference. That caused a lot of heartburn and anger in some quarters in Israel, which then got replayed through American politics. So there was a lot of criticism of the U.S. For doing this. And then there other developments happened. Some other countries made statements. So then the U.S. started, backing away, saying, "Wait, maybe this isn't going to make any sense after all, or people aren't going to be serious." And so there's a lot of kind of toing and froing on whether and how to go ahead with this. The U.S. government has now in a sense, re-energized a bit. It's looking for a country to host potentially the conference and to be the lead facilitator. And I think there are 3 candidate countries that are being explored now.
Okay. All right. Well, now that we've solved the whole Middle East problem, why don't we move on to Pakistan, where I think you think the threat of instability is not as grave, at least as it applies to the security of their nuclear weapons, is not as grave as some people think, right?
Well, what I say is, and you have to think about it for a minute, what I say is that nuclear weapons are the safest, most secure thing in Pakistan.
I'm trying to think of an analogy.
Right. And so then you have to tell me how safe and secure Pakistan is. But I would not say that those weapons are safe and secure. It's just that they're the safest and most secure things in Pakistan.
Right.
Therefore, I would focus my worry on the stuff that's more fundamental in Pakistan, which is, for example, does the army hold together, and is the army continuously led by people who at least believe in the modern world? Or is there an internal coup and dislocation in the army, and you get people in the leadership of that institution who actually, were on Osama bin Laden's side, or or believe, in going back in time for the future of Pakistan, because that's the gravest threat in a variety of ways to everything in Pakistan, including the nuclear weapons.
Now, in something you wrote about this, you said that in Pakistan, the threat to the security of their nuclear weapons is conceived in an entirely different way than we conceive it, right?
Yeah.
What is that? What is their concern?
Well, I mean, and you saw it. You got the vignette, the commercial view of it right after the Osama bin Laden raid. So, U.S. Special Forces go in there and they get Osama bin Laden. And people go on U.S. television for the next day saying, oh, my God, Osama bin Laden was living that close to a Pakistani military academy. That must mean that terrorists could be that close to their nuclear weapons, because if this guy could get to the heart of Pakistan, who knows where else the terrorists could get? They could steal the nuclear weapon. The Pakistanis looked at the same episode and they said, oh, my God, the Americans can fly commando units across our country right up next to our military academy and kill and snatch Osama bin Laden. Surely they must be able to do that to our nuclear weapons, too. So the U.S. is going to come steal our nuclear weapons.
So that's their concern.
Yeah.
I guess another case in which the way people look at the world in other countries is not exactly the way we look at it. So is there given your assessment of the problem there, that there isn't a security problem in the sense of, really kind of faulty, kind of a failure to secure the perimeters of nuclear facilities or that kind of thing, it's not clear to me what follows in terms of things we might be able to do now to make the situation more stable from our point of view, right?
Right. Well, right, and there's a lot of debate and uncertainty on it. I have what may be a more controversial view on it, which is I think we ought to recognize that the U.S. has been a very active player in Pakistan since around 1953. That most of our active playing there has been to support and financially beef up the Pakistani military and intelligence services, because they were doing things we wanted them to do, in addition to things we didn't want them to do, but they were also helping us, spy on the Soviet Union or drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan or open up relations with China. So we basically enabled this dysfunctional institution, the Pakistani military, including the intelligence services, to just grow bigger and bigger and stronger to the point where they dominate Pakistan. And they have a psychology that's so obsessed with fighting India and with projecting power outside the country, and has been so dedicated to repressing, genuine kind of democratic parties in Pakistan, that we've helped kind of create this monster in Pakistan. And we ought to acknowledge that we don't know how to make it better. We don't know how to, quote, help Pakistan to do better. And so we ought to start getting out of there. And the withdrawal from Afghanistan allows us to do that because we don't need Pakistan for transit as much to get stuff into Afghanistan. And so we ought to say, look, to the Pakistani military, we're not going to keep pushing you to attack on the Afghan border and do the stuff we want, but we're also not going to offer you money anymore. To the extent that we stay here, it's to provide assistance to the Pakistani civilian population as they ask for it. And if they don't want us either, if they've become very anti-American, we can hear that also and leave. But if they actually would like the assistance and they're willing to work with us, then they can apply for the assistance like you apply in a foundation. But to just change the whole conception of what we do and our posture there from one of kind of this overweening presence tied at the hip with the military and the intelligence services, we got to leave and stop enabling that situation and basically give them space to come to terms with the fact that Pakistan is really messed up for internal reasons, not because of external
Well, I would think a virtue of that, which I think is separate from the one you're citing, of kind of us getting out of the picture, would be that our presence and our collaboration with the government, I assume, adds fuel to the insurgency that people see as one of the most potentially destabilizing things, and one of the things that could ultimately put nuclear weapons in the hands of some Al-Qaeda-like people.
That's absolutely it. I mean, the view and the argument the insurgents make is the army is fighting America's war.
Right.
So the army, in order to get money to enrich itself, is doing the Americans' bidding, at least to some extent, and fighting their war and killing our people and so on and so forth. And so that's right.
Wouldn't it be amazing if this overall critique of our foreign policy turned out to be true, that basically many of our problems are a result of our own involvement in these places, and we could just kind of like quit having wars and stuff and quit spending all this money, and that would actually help things?
Well, it would be, and I come to it belatedly and inductively by just looking around at things I've seen and have happened, and why it's so hard to deal with is I think our intentions, our collective intentions, the intentions of the American people have always been really positive. So it's very hard to accept at some point that it really, really doesn't work and that it backfires because you say, we just been trying to help.
Yeah.
But at some point you look at it and, you learn this in private life and you can learn it in public life. At some point you just say, well, whatever our intentions are, it's really backfiring. So I'm going to give you some space and I'm going to leave. I do it with heavy heart, wishing you well, but I just got to get out of your picture.
Now, that's an interesting analogy between foreign policy and our conduct of our own social lives. I hadn't thought of that one. You don't have any personal anecdotes you'd like to share with us here by way of fleshing out the analogy?
A little bit, but I mean, some of it. I mean, with children. I have a young adult son, and like there's sometimes you want to help so much and you provide so much and give it, and then at some point you realize, it's just not working. It's either too much pressure or he doesn't want to be that way anyway, and so finally you kind of go, all right, you're right. You make your own mistakes. I'm gonna back off and you set the terms.
There you go. I have some relevant experience of that sort myself. Well, that's interesting. And I think that overall critique of foreign policy is really gaining momentum, don't you think? I mean, partly, in the Republican Party, for one place, for one thing, and that, that may. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I think it's gaining some momentum, but my concern about it is how it's thought first of all, and then how it's expressed. Because you can stop enabling somebody and step back out of deep love and respect for that person, which you can communicate, or you can do it out of contempt and haughtiness and anger, which is then very unbecoming and counterproductive. And so I think, now the result may be the same. You walk out. but the way in which you do it is very important, and I certainly would be in favor of being as respectful as possible and as offering an ongoing availability and relationship to the people of a given country, but just saying, look, at the state-to-state level with institutions the way they are, it's just not working. As opposed to, these are lying, cheating bastards, they double gamed us, and screw them, we're out of here.
Or this whole culture or whole religion or whatever is so screwed up that they will forever,
There you go.
There's that too. And I think that's not too constructive either. A kind of related thing is how discriminating you are in your withdrawal. I think this is not quite the same thing. I mean, a thoroughgoing isolationist wants not only no kind of military involvement, but no involvement in, kind of a John Bolton's a bad example because he's not an isolationist in the military sense,
he wants to bomb
just in
them,
the global governance sense. But I mean, there's a type of isolationist who wants to withdraw from involvement in the United Nations and withdraw from all multilateral institutions that can help us share burdens and so on. So that's another question in terms of how the politics of this play out.
Right. No, and I think that's right, and I think what I would favor is, as much engagement at the societal level, including that supported by governments, but it's networking, it's engagement. It's the opposite of isolation in a sense. So if students from Pakistan want to come to American universities, do as much as we can to make that possible. Facilitate exchanges. If continue to make money available, but perhaps through multilateral bodies, for education reform in Pakistan. So you stay engaged to help kind of people elevate themselves, to help people help themselves. It's more like George Bush Sr.'s kind of 1,000 points of light mentality, but taken globally with that same kind of, I think, positive spirit, rather than this isolation of we're just coming back to the American shores and don't want to have anything to do with the rest of the world. That's you can't do that anymore. Okay.
Well, this has been very enlightening for me. Now I'll let you get back to packing for wherever you're heading next. Where are you heading next?
I'm going to Paris tonight for a couple of days of meetings, and then to Turkey.
And you've been to Turkey before?
No, I haven't. I'm really looking forward to it. It's a country that I think is increasingly really, really important. So I'm
important, and I think potentially constructive in a way that not everyone concedes. But
I agree entirely. I think the kind of criticism and that kind of buds in Washington on Turkey is totally counterproductive and not earned.
Well, you will soon know a lot more about it than I do. Maybe I'll get a chance to hear your insights when you come back. But I'll let you get back to packing. Thanks so much for taking the time.
No, thank you.
Okay.
Really appreciate it, Bob.
Take care, George.
Thanks a lot.